the podcast. So I'm gonna give a little bit of silence here. Okay. All right. Hello. Welcome to the podcast. This is another episode of the Bryan Kim podcast, and today our guest here is Isabella Tam. Um, we actually kind of go back, with work. We used to work together. We graduated from the same schools at different years. I was class of 2012. You can elaborate in a bit, but currently, right now, you're working with Ken Tang, one of our previous podcast guests, for his campaign. And we could probably talk about that a little later. But today, our focus is talking about what's happening in Hong Kong. I'm very much interested in what's going on out there. As I mentioned before in one of our podcasts with Kalani, I talked about how kind of the protest movement in Hong Kong in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement and like within the Asian community, we put up this pedestal when it comes to Hong Kong. But if it's Asian for Black lives, it's like gets touchy. But I don't necessarily think we're going to get into that in this podcast. But I want to just focus in on Hong Kong and that issue, and hopefully, if there's more time, I can we could dive into the other thing about Asians for Black lives. But right now, is there anything I missed, Isabella? Bella?
I just kind of wanted to introduce myself and how I relate to this subject. So, um, I'm not a person from Hong Kong. I was born in the US.
Mm-hmm.
My family, like my parents and my grandparents, were all from Hong Kong. Actually, most of my family is still Hong Kong. So this issue is really close to me and my family.
Mm-hmm. And just to kind of start with it, so I think if you haven't followed the news, or if for those that haven't seen what's been happening in Asia, Hong Kong has been kind of like in the throes of many protest movements, even going back to 2014 with the umbrella marches, right?
Hmm.
Is that correct? And that
Yes.
and that was for, I believe, what I recall and read is that they've detained booksellers, right?
Yeah.
And
So the
producers.
whole umbrella movement started because Hong Kong wanted to nominate its own elected officials.
Oh, that's right.
Um,
That's right. Yeah.
they wanted true democracy, and the system that they have right now is that they can
Mm-hmm.
appoint their own candidates, but it has to be China vetted.
Mm.
So they have to be approved. So it's not true democracy.
And was Carrie Lam in power at the time, like 2014, or?
I'm not sure. We'll have to fact check
Yeah,
that.
we're gonna have to fact check that. But moving from 2014 and then to the movement in 2019, they wanted to have this extradition bill, and this was something that I believe was the summer, like the late spring or and summer, that started happening.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
within this year.
yeah, and then I was also a little side tangent. I was at a Rosemead Moon Autumn Mid Autumn Festival, and then there was an impromptu democracy protest for Hong Kong, and then I did take some pictures, and there was a interesting questions because a lot of people were thinking that I was press or something. I was like, I'm just there taking pictures, but I was having these interesting conversations with people that really believed in this cause, and like Asian Americans for Hong Kong democracy. And that's how I'm slightly tangentially three times removed sort of situation of how I fit into this whole Hong Kong conversation, and also you and how much you know. And so, and m- moving forward in the timeline, so when a lot of this coronavirus things were happening, it's a lot of the stories and the news on like a US level, like a lot of that has gone by the wayside because we were focusing on coronavirus. But in Hong Kong, what I found out is that they continue to march, they continue to have their voices heard when it came to this extradition bill. And then now in June, they put this new security law to try to stem like the violence, in the Chinese central Chinese government's eyes is that like the violence that has been going on since 2019, and this what this bills mean what this bill mean is that like human rights, normal human rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to just have a dissenting opinion about the central Chinese government um, is being criminalized. And people, what I've heard recently, that a big book event in Hong Kong, a lot of publishers and people are like self-centering, self-censorship of what they're trying to produce, and it's almost like a new chapter in Hong Kong kind of history. And I just want to get an idea of how you're feeling, because this is so many years, like it's since 2014 and up until now, and you've since visited Hong Kong at one point,
A
and
couple times actually.
a couple times. Okay,
Yeah, since
so I want to kind of dive in and get your opinions and your point of view of what's been happening.
right. I mean, I was just in Hong Kong this summer.
Hmm.
Not for protest reasons, but I was able to fit in some time to also participate and show my support for well, the youngsters and our generation.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's really strange because as an Asian American, we value like, freedom and this is America, but we have to realize that um, Hong Kong and China and whatever, they run very differently from how we do.
Hmm.
Um, so what just really makes me like mad and frustrated and like all these strong emotions um, is how China is not respecting Hong Kong because they don't have to.
Yeah. It's
Right.
almost as like historically there was like like an economic incentive to say that when the handover happened in the 90s, that Hong Kong is this economic powerhouse, and we got to respect Hong Kong because it is an economic driver within the Chinese community. But now, since Shenzhen and Guangzhou, like these areas
Economic
where
zones.
these
Yep.
special economic zones that's been cropping up, like even in the early 2000s, Hong Kong's role in Chinese policy has kind of demeaned, like became less than. um, uh, I can't think of better words right now.
Yeah.
But the history is that the handover happened in 98, right? I believe
97.
97. And China has this policy of um, one party, two systems. Is that correct? Or I believe so, where
It's something. Yeah, it is
something
one
along the
one
lines.
one country, two system.
Yeah,
Or
one country, two systems. So Hong Kong, I think to some degree, Taiwan is in that, right? Um,
uh, Taiwan is recognized by some institutions and some organizations as its own country,
mhm.
but it's also not recognized, of course, by China.
Yeah, and then Macau is also is in there too, right? I believe so.
Macau is sort of like the Hong Kong situation, but they're more like what I've seen people describe as a more submissive Hong Kong brother.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So
So
China's like the parent.
yeah, so it's like these are kind of like the players, when it comes to the central Chinese conversation, where um within the case of Hong Kong, what I've remembered is that it's 2040, somewhere around that time. It's when Hong Kong formally enters China as like a one kind of nation
Yeah. 50 years
situation
from 97.
from 97. And now, I think in 2020, we're seeing that Hong Kong is really being pressured by China to really follow central Chinese governance. With the situation with Carrie Lam, and then this situation with this new security law and the extradition bill, like it's almost getting to a point, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's almost a feeling that Hong Kong is losing its own identity, almost.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Hmm. Did you ever get a sense of that, like when you were traveling to Hong Kong, that like, there's there at one point there is that protest movement, and in some cases, like in Vice, they were talking about how the TV programs are, instead of being in Cantonese, which is spoken in Hong Kong, it's being switched over to Mandarin, and this
Yeah.
idea that um Hong Kong's culture and identity is being drowned out by central Chinese government. So did you had a sense of feeling with that, or did some families, some people in your family notice that at all?
It's not a sense of feeling, it's very obvious, and it's just there. For let's say for immigration or for visitation and stuff like that, to go to Hong Kong, mainland Chinese citizens do not need a permit. They don't need a what's that thing called?
A visa?
A visa. Thank you. They don't need a visa. Nothing. They can just go through. And immigration is the numbers of immigration from mainland China to Hong Kong are so massive.
Hmm.
But when Hong Kongers go to visit mainland China, they do need a visa. So
Yeah.
right, that's trying to say something. Um, and TVB, one of its Hong Kong's biggest TV stations, which is also very popular here within the Cantonese community in the US.
Hmm.
I was watching it with my mom the other day, and I don't understand Mandarin, but I do understand Cantonese. And what I've noticed was they've dubbed over a lot of the shows, as in these shows are produced in partnership. Like some of the actors were mainland Chinese actors, and some of the actors were Hong Kong actors.
Hmm.
And so if this was being broadcasted in Hong Kong or in the US, for Cantonese folks, they would dub over it with Cantonese. So you can tell the lip syncing. It's not really synchronized. You can tell it's dubbed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And I feel like that erasure of Hong Kong identity, and this is something that, of the documentaries and stuff that I've seen on YouTube, is that like Hong Kong wanted to be its own independent kind of nation state, in the vein of um oh, well, it's not Singapore, but what's the other place that's like it's a small micronation that has a lot of economic power, that's in the in kind of like the Asian continent, but my mind kind of
Singapore?
Singapore kind of want to be its own kind of like Singapore sort of situation, wanted independence from Britain, but now at this day and age wants independence from China, and it's almost as if it's like it's an untenable situation. It's kind of like it's David Goliath dynamic of, this is China it's the um standing on Hong Kong and putting pressure, and it's do you feel like it's Hong Kong can survive this situation,
I
or
don't necessarily think Hong Kong was trying to separate from China, at least not at first.
mhm,
Um, because after 97, a lot of Vox talked about how they did a survey
mhm,
of whether or not people from Hong Kong identified as Chinese or they identified as being from Hong Kong.
mhm,
And we can see the shift as soon as China starts encroaching on Hong Kong's um, space. Hong Kong people started kind of um, like just not accepting it. They don't want to be forced into this identity.
mhm,
And so because of all the pressure and stuff, and how aggressive China is being with their policies and with the how they're handling the protest and everything.
Hmm.
People are kind of sick of it and they just want to be cut off.
Yeah. And I know we've been talking about this security law and what's been happening recently. I'm just gonna quickly read off some of the stuff that's been written in that law. So, according to the BBC, the some of the new key provisions is crimes of succession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces will be punishable by a maximum sentence of life in prison. Damaged property of public transportation. So I guess it's assuming it's buses can be considered terrorism. Um, Companies can be fined if convicted under this law. So, and another thing, in addition, Hong Kong will have to establish its own national security commission to enforce laws with someone that's Beijing appointed advisors. So the and I'll link this article down in the description, but uh, that's just kind of the highlights of what's going on. And we've been seeing a lot of examples right now. Someone that displayed independent, like a Hong Kong independence flag, get arrested. Um, and you shared me this article that well, the protest movements, the vitality of the protest movement has been uh, kind of subsided once the security law has passed. And so I just can't imagine some of these activists and leaders in Hong Kong are feeling. Um, yeah.
Right. Well, what China and what Beijing sees with these Hong Kong protests is that these people are anarchists, that these people just don't want government, don't want to be ruled, don't want to follow laws, they're troublemakers who want to take down the government.
Mhm.
We can see this from mainland Chinese propaganda saying these Hong Kong people are Congo roaches. Like, the more you try to crush them down like they're bugs, but they keep coming.
Mhm.
And it's just really frustrating how that's how the government, that's how Beijing wants everyone else to see these protesters.
And it's very dehumanizing almost. And it's like
Mhm.
if you just consider, it's like these are people that just want to be live free and just want to be able to criticize government and say, like, if that something doesn't sound right to me, I'd be willing to talk about it and like have a discussion. But it's almost as if almost years and years since the 90s, it's like it's chipping away at it little by little.
Right.
Yeah.
The security law was popular or was passed among pro Beijing people
Hmm.
is because obviously it's to silence those protesters and those voices. We well, of course, we in the US, we can display our protest to America by flag burning, and
Hmm.
that's completely legal through Texas v. Johnson.
Hmm.
But um, if you burn a Chinese flag, you can get arrested and go to jail for that.
Yeah. And I had a conversation with a friend, and she's an immigrant from Cambodia, and says like, "Oh yeah, flag burning is wrong," but I just want to put it in perspective. It's like, think of it this way: it's like it a flag burning is a form of political protest. It's saying something, and if it bothers you, I feel like it should. The question shouldn't be let's ban it. The question is why is this happening, and let's address these things.
Right.
Um and um and it shouldn't be a conversation of like let's absolutely outlaw it. It's kind of like the Kaepernick thing when people were kneeling down. People's knee-jerk reaction was like, "You can't do that towards the national anthem," and it's like that's a protest. We should.
There's a root, there's a cause.
There's a cause, and like trying to like saying that it should be outlawed or something. It takes away from that kind of protest. It takes away that meaning, and it makes it sound like I'm for flag burning, but to some degree, it's like it's a freedom. It's something in the U.S. that people can do. In other countries, you can be killed. In other countries, so like maybe in Cambodia, I don't know 100%, but like maybe in Cambodia, like if you burn the flag, you'll get arrested and you could be sent away in life in prison, you know. And in the US, we're allotted certain freedoms, and I think in Hong
Right.
Kong, you know, it's it's freedom to talk, it's a freedom to write your own opinions, it's a freedom to have a
It's the
separate
freedom of
identity.
thought.
Yeah, and it's just kind of sad, like what's happening. And I feel like this is not just a necessarily just a Hong Kong thing, but I feel like it's throughout the world. And I think, and I mentioned to you that we'll continue the conversation of Hong Kong, but like this whole Belt and Road Initiative, where Beijing is literally incentivizing countries to act, you know, against human rights, almost to for China's own personal gains
For economic purposes.
and for economic purposes. Yeah. So yeah. So, sorry, I feel like as we're having this conversation, I'm also being very much reflective at the same time, and trying to contextualize my own personal emotions almost. Hello. Oh, what just happened? Oh no. Are we having our first technical difficulties? Record onto the computer. And okay, we're back. All right. I'm sorry. We're in the middle of talking about the central Chinese government and internet went out.
Yeah.
Some spooky stuff. I'm just kidding. It was probably just internet and router.
Yeah.
You know, things happen when we're using technology, especially in the days of COVID. So I think we were just having a conversation about how
The security law, right?
the security law and kind of the feeling of the protest now, that it almost feels like this is a almost a death nail onto what's been happening in Hong Kong. That this new law basically criminalizes anybody that's wanting to march and wanting to speak out, wanting to produce content in a way that says that just has a dissenting opinion in you know, against China. And now um, people are feeling like, you know, the movements is over. Do you feel like you have that same feeling? Do you have a sense of that?
Um, I think the movement is far from over. I
Hmm.
don't want to sound I'm a very pragmatic, or I have a very pragmatic view saying that the the conclusion or the results of this would probably be maybe Western countries stepping in to help these
Hmm.
protesters out, which we're already seeing with the BNOs. Um, and it will not be favorable for people who are in are in this movement.
Hmm. What do you mean by BNOs? British nationals or?
Yes. So, um, if you have a if you have a British passport, because Hong Kong does have a special passport apart from mainland China, and so what some countries are, this is in the talks. It's saying that what they want to do is that they want to allow these people with BNOs with the British passports to be able to immigrate and to leave Hong Kong, um, because of the
Because of this new
encroachment.
law and everything that's been happening with the government, and you were saying a lot of Western countries are trying to do something about, you know, how China is being is treating Hong Kong. One of the things that recently came out is that the U.S. response to all of this, and our current President Trump has end Hong Kong special preferential status, which basically, from what I gather, is that China has been using Hong Kong as a way um, to economically benefit in on a global scale. And you know, I don't necessarily disagree with something like this. I feel like if China is restricting human rights and doing these policies to silence opposition and criminalize protests, like, yeah, I can agree with to some degree with what Trump is doing, and that is very tough coming from me.
Yeah.
Definitely very tough from coming from me. So, um, and more to come. I hope most Western countries can come along and say, like, you know what, why are we doing business with a country that's like criminalizing free speech? Why are we doing,
Right.
yeah, and
Human
like,
rights.
and human rights abuses, especially when it comes to the Uyghur minority in China, and like basically concentration camps happening on the eastern and wait on the far end of China, and getting close to the border of like India and
And
um
yeah.
yeah. And yeah, I just hope that there can be this renewed conversation of like where your product is being sold to, or where it's coming from, and
Right. Making sure this is all ethical.
making sure it's ethical. And if a company is like, I think someone is trying to do a database of if a luxury brand is doing business with China, like, oh, here's the information, and here's how much the Chinese government is either investments in talks with, have censored products before, and there are some things to be said about how Hollywood movies and like basically anything entertainment goes through me. It's like it's on my radar. Like, especially like, say, Doctor Strange, they changed the character because they the Chinese government is like, Tibet is not a country, essentially, and that changed this character to a different type of monk. I think the new Top Gun movie right now, um one of the aircraft carriers in the movies has a Taiwanese flag. China put the whole kibosh on that too, saying that Taiwan is not its own country; it's China. And so,
You can
um,
see what they did to Mulan, obviously.
hmm
Putting a mainland Chinese actress as the leading role.
hmm
Yeah.
yeah, and I don't know uh, if you said this, but for me, out of protest, it's like, I as much as I like Mulan as an animated movie, I was like, I'm not gonna monetarily support Mulan in a way where I think the actress herself chastised the protest movement, right?
She did on whatever social media site she's using in China.
hmm and and that comes down to, like, it's Disney. It's like, including Disney, which I already have my reservations about when it comes to creativity and them being gatekeepers of all of these different properties, but especially when it comes to representing their own material, like, say, Star Wars, right? Uh, it didn't do so well because China doesn't necessarily have the same cultural background that Star Wars has in the West, but um, they censored one of the African American characters on the poster, and I'm just like,
Oh, that I did not know. Wow.
do you not know? So the anti-blackness in China has been a thing,
Yes,
especially
that I know.
when we heard about what happened with African or the black community in China getting evicted, and that was like a big news on some of the most initial coronavirus news. But going back to what I was saying about Disney and China is that um, Finn, John Boyega's character,
Yes.
he is and a black citizen from the UK, and an actor, and he's predominantly shown in the movie, and he had a pretty big space in the poster, but for the Chinese market, they they made his image smaller and put it somewhere else, so it's like less noticeable. and
Wow.
and China just basically said, I was like, oh yeah, yeah, we'll do that, so to make sure. And this is a poster. This is not the movie. They didn't edit anybody out, but this is like a company saying, because we want to be in the Chinese market, and because there's so much value in the Chinese market, we're willing to self-center ourselves. And this is, and I was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast. It's like when they had Melissa Chen, I think a Singaporean journalist that works in the U.S. is that this is no bullets. There wasn't a war. Like they're self-centering because there's an economic benefit, and that they see that it's because it's an economic benefit. They're willing to do these things, and
Their businesses after all.
their businesses, yeah. And for me as a consumer, you got to weigh those things and understand as like if this business is willing to self-center or say for instance the new Pixar movie Onward, right? Or the blink and you'll miss it LGBTQ moment in Star Wars, and it's like it feels like they want one foot in being progressive and like showing these types of movies, but one foot back because they want to cater to a different country's point of view almost.
Hmm.
And it's very dicey, and this is something that I feel like consumers should know and consumers should understand. And I'm not saying don't buy it or don't support it if you like it. It's just this should be data for you to consume and say, okay, if you say as a citizen value free speech and value freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, like really consider, is that designer handbag worth it if they're doing business
Right.
in China or
It's much bigger than just the product itself.
yeah.
Yeah.
And going from there, on a larger topic of Hong Kong and how other countries basically do business in China, and there's this kind of idea of this one belt one road initiative where I think China is now trying to get more influence in different parts of the world, especially places like in Africa, developing nations, and almost giving out these loans where it's so exorbitant that countries even kind of default on these loans. And China basically says, well, since we built that, that belongs to us now. These roads that we built, they belong to us now. So these countries that decided to do business with um, the central Chinese government, they're ending up not being able to reap the rewards of having new roads, having new ports, and having these things. And now it's almost, yeah, and being willing to work with other dictators, and it's, I don't know, it's so complicated, and it's so it's so nuanced. And I feel like and one of these German news networks that does English language documentaries on the subject, says that um Europe has a very different relationship than what the US has. The US has that tenuous trade relationship, but in places like Germany and the UK, it's like it seems much more closer. And having that, um, like say Boris Johnson having that conversation of letting Hong Kong citizens come to the UK, like what's that, like how is that gonna affect UK and Chinese relationships, because they've been doing business in a much more broader way than the US. Yeah.
Yeah, just I think that China has become this really, really big global superpower.
Hmm.
And we thought, we as Americans, we thought that helping them with these special economic zones and investing in these, um, in their in doing business there, in their factories, that would allow them to, oh, look at Western countries, we don't we don't abuse our people, or w- they're violating these human rights and stuff. Um, Giving them some economic uh, boost might help them be more progressive in that, which actually completely went left. They're now using their economic power to leverage over these, not only nearby Asian countries, but like you said, the African countries as well.
Yeah, these broader investments in say uh, if you're a nation like say in Africa that wants to do good with their community and want to provide infrastructure and stuff like that, but at the same time support from the West says, oh, you have to do X, 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 and X, right? And China comes in saying like, oh, no strings attached. we'll do these things for you, and here's the bill, just pay it over time. It's
Seems like a
almost,
better deal,
it
right?
seems like a better deal,
Yeah.
and there's no strings attached in the sense that's like, oh, they don't necessarily have to comply with human rights, they don't have to comply with formal constitutions and democracies. And so when they see an offer like in the Chinese case, they're going to take it because it's like, oh, they just go and just build roads for us.
I think another reason why the Chinese deal seems more appealing
Mhm.
is because of history, how Western countries have used these economic deals to bait poor countries into colonizing them.
That's true, yeah.
That
And
could be, some people are still affected. There's some people who are alive, and
mhm.
some countries are still colonies of westernized countries,
and
Western
kind of
countries.
and kind of reeling from that almost, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if it's like it's colonialism in the sense that it has, like, the rules hasn't changed, but the the flyer, or like the window dressing is just different, you
Right,
know.
they're
Yeah.
trying to it the core of it is the same, but there it looks different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just a matter of it may sound like we're beating around the bush, but it sounds like it's a very authoritarian government really trying to impose its own kind of rules onto other countries. And it almost feels as if it's another form of like Cold War in the I think the CBS documentary that they were talking about. But
Yeah, it's a culture war. It's really intruding on people's personal lives and their
mhm,
thoughts and everything.
yeah. And seeing how much that goes down to, it's like on an economic level, like some countries feel like they have to be dependent on China to economically move forward. And I think there was something to be said, I think, in Germany, that says 40% of people would want to have better relationships with China versus like the US, which is like, I think it's only slightly higher at like 45, you know.
That is I think that is one thing that is very interesting because America, the United States, we owe so much debt to China, but yet
Mhm.
we can also hate them. Like it feels like that parent and child relationship where the parent is giving the child money, but
Mhm.
you can't hate on your parents because they're supplying you with money,
Yeah,
right? That's
yeah,
so
that's kind of
strange.
strange in a way, but I think that came about because of what happened in 2008, right, when the US had a lot of debt and China was willing to buy that debt, right?
Right, right.
And it was a country that said, and it wasn't necessarily like a trade with like just like it was not necessarily like a physical trade, but it was a concept trade of like they're buying what we had owed. So like they're just buying a debt. This is as if it's a lending company said, "Hey, this person owes this much money. Let's buy that from the company, and this debt company has to force this other person to pay off that debt." You know, and I'm probably butchering the way of explaining it, but it's but it's as if you owed a lot of money, and it's took so long to owe that money that the company itself sold it to some other company, like a different entity that's now in charge of dealing with dealing with that debt and those things. And so, yeah, sorry, I think I went on a tangent there.
All goods back to Hong Kong and China.
Yeah, well, just China and how they bought the US debt,
Hmm.
and now is wanting to cash in on that now, given current circumstances of like coronavirus and everything else that's been happening recently. So sorry.
It's a lot. It
It's a
really is
lot.
a lot.
I feel like, especially within parents, I think within Asian parents, it almost feels like the conversation of China is always omnipresent. And I don't know, probably more so for you. I don't know. I can't make any
Very
judgment.
much. My parents and a lot of their friends, they have their WhatsApp group and they share. I mean, of course, okay, yes, there is mainland propaganda, but there is also propaganda from the other side,
Hmm.
which also might not be true.
Yeah.
And um, misinformation today is just so, we're all drowning in information. We don't know what's real, what's not. And it's
Hmm.
very hard unless really have to like get out of your way to fact check things and make sure this is true or not. And most people don't have the time to, or they're not going to want to. They're just going to take the information as it is.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think as I mentioned it with, I think the podcast I did about housing, is that a lot of people are just, they just take the lead on an article and said, okay, well, that's all I need to know, the headline, and that's about it.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what my conversations at home have been. They've been about how um, China bad, and then Hong Kong is fighting against this evil. But at the same time, um, unfortunately, my parents aren't voters, but they, I wouldn't call them Trump supporters because they don't vote, but they do like Trump and
Mhm.
how supposedly tough he is on China.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, because of the what is that thing called? The economic war?
The trade,
The
trade war,
trade
the
war.
trade, yeah.
Yes. The trade war that Trump is doing with China. Um, my parents are just, they're really happy with that, and that overshadows all of the negatives that Trump has apparently.
Yeah, and calling it the Chinese flu, and how does that, affect Asian Americans, and not just Chinese American, Asian Americans. I've
Yeah,
had,
Asian Americans for
yeah.
sure.
Um, I think the conversations in my household too is like, because there's a lot of investment happening in Cambodia with, in regards to that, this prime minister at this point is a dictator, censoring dissent, opposition leaders being in exile, political killings happening, within the past 10 years, in the past decade. um, you know it is that same conversation of China bad, Cambodia like needs democracy almost, and this, the whole Trump tough on China conversation. Yeah, that's happening here in my household too.
Yeah, I guess this is just like an awareness, like a PSA saying how um most of the media, most of what's being pushed is, I guess, East Asians in the US as Asian Americans.
Hmm.
But there are so many Southeast Asian issues as well that
Yeah.
aren't as visible.
Hmm. Yeah, South Asian, like Indian, Pakistan, and um I'd be willing to even extend that to Middle Eastern, North African, almost to some degree.
Yeah, yeah.
Having to deal with, if we go down this line of trade war with China, it's like, how does Asians living abroad will be affected, not on just an economic level, but almost on a social level. If we identify the enemy as Chinese, how much can, a person living in the South can contextualize that and say, make a blanket statement saying all Asians, regardless of who they are the enemy, and that's
Right.
something that should be looked at and talked about, because if we're going to go down this road, there's going to be some unfortunate consequences and casualties, in a sense of, like, these
Right.
communities.
Even people who aren't Chinese, like when we talk about Vincent Chin, how supposedly the people who murdered Vincent Chin thought he was Japanese, but in fact he was Chinese. Or the Japanese internment camps, how they targeted other Asians even though they weren't Japanese.
Yeah, and it's weird how that changes from decade to decade. The time when Vincent Chin happened was a time when like Japanese automakers were being put on a pedestal, and the US reaction to that was basically, well, we can't do anything about it, and therefore places in Detroit had this whole built up frustration about Japanese automakers, that they're willing to do something like what happened with Vincent Chin, and stuff like that shouldn't happen, and
Hmm.
I don't know what the right answer is at that point, and of course 100% what happened to Vincent Chin, absolutely horrifying. And even now I think, what I if I remember the from the workplace that we used to work with, they were talking about it. Even the family of Vincent Chin, like, they didn't get justice at all.
Right,
um
right. Yeah, so
and
words like the Kung flu or the Chinese virus is very dangerous.
mhm. Have you ever felt that? I know we live in a predominantly kind of like Asian and Latin American Chicano community. Have you ever had that happen to you, where somebody was like, "Oh, because you're Asian, you have to think twice about interacting with them," especially during the pandemic?
Right. I personally haven't experienced that at all, but just being on social media, and it's just amazing how fast personal stories, like how Facebook is being used as a storytelling platform and experiences, people are able to document this stuff on
Mhm.
video. And it's just so crazy how these things, like so much hate and these racist attacks are happening to people in my community, like people like me. But I'm personally not the one being attacked.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember going into an Italian market, and then I think one of the customers looked at me very weird, and I was just like, "Listen, I'm wearing a mask. You're wearing a mask. We're both in an Italian market. Why are we doing this right now? Why are we why are we having this interaction where I'm just like, I feel like I laughed it off, and I think I mentioned this on a podcast before prior, but like I just laughed it off because it just seems weird that I'm having this interaction right now in San
Right.
Gabriel in an
Yeah,
Italian market."
right. I'm not sure. I work at a grocery store, so when I help people, some people are very, I don't know if they were having a bad day or if they were being rude for no reason or if it was because of racism that when I ask people, being a nice employee, I ask, "Hey, do you need any help or can I assist you with anything?"
Mhm.
Um I notice that some people are quick to shut me down, that they don't want my help, they'll go and ask someone else.
Yeah, it's it's kind of scary being Asian right now in the US, a little bit. I know it's I feel more confident because we live in a predominantly, Asian centric area of California, but like there are places that are more um I to some degree more prejudiced. I There was some worry that I have family that owns a business in a separate state, and but they kept on getting health calls over and over again. And I was just kind of thinking, it gets to a point where you think, because of coronavirus and because we're Asian, it's like, are they just targeting us? Because one or two times, sure, fine. But when it almost gets up to the tens, I'm like, okay, somebody's out for us as an Asian
Right, right.
eatery. Yeah.
That that makes sense.
Yeah. And sorry, I feel like we just had this like long protracted conversation about race and being Asian American. But going back a little bit to China and Hong Kong, but I think just kind of wrapping up in a sense of like, we're going to talk a little bit about protest movements here and what's been happening. Um, do you feel that there's hope, especially as with family in Hong Kong, that things can get better given
Um,
what's been happening? And you know, we had this conversation only focusing on Hong Kong and China, but like, because of how much power they have, even in other state, not other states, but other countries, other nations, and even companies. Like they have a lot of power and sway between companies. Do you feel like there is some hope for Hong Kong? Uh,
I realistically don't think so. Hong Kong is just so powerful. I noticed a lot of young Hong Kong people come either to the States or either to Australia and the UK to go to school, to go to university, um, either to hopefully be able to get a job where they're studying, or find a partner in these countries to to immigrate to. It's, I mean, my family's doing that. Both of my cousins went to university in the UK. So really, that's, I guess this is some type of outlet for them to maybe have a way to leave.
hmm a way to kind of almost escape the situation. W- if you're say, what would your advice be for someone that's young in Hong Kong right now? Like talking to them. Yeah, I know this is not necessarily you're the voice, like the voice of Hong Kong, but what would be your advice for someone that's going through something like this in Hong Kong?
Well, I really don't think I can give advice to anyone in Hong Kong because I'm not living through it.
That's
And
true.
as a supporter from a different country, I'm I just want to listen to them. And I guess if I were to say some words to them, it would be to say something, to act out, because people are supporting you globally,
hmm
whether you know it or not, whether you you're allowed to or allowed to see it on the internet or whatever.
hmm
But yeah, people can see the struggle and to continue fighting the system, even, and of course there are risks. It is very dangerous. Um,
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot that
and it is understandable if you don't speak out.
hmm
That is a-okay. If you don't agree but you don't speak out, that is a-okay.
yeah. There's like a lot of different ways, like visually in the arts and writing, and trying to get your voice out there in some way. If it's not on a yelling protest way, there got to be some form of outlet out of folks who live there. I know this may sound very condescending coming from people from the US having this conversation about Hong Kong. I don't know what else to say other than I want to say that I support protests in these areas where they feel like their rights are being stripped away from them. Like we live in a country where we kind of hide behind our our freedoms almost, and I think my hope is that and then to some degree this podcast, that people can hear from someone that does follow um what's been happening in Hong Kong, does have family in those areas, and is being affected by it in a more tangible way than how I'm feeling about it, you know. So I think that's my hope with all of this. Um, uh, just to close out, I feel there was only one thing that I kind of wanted to talk to you about, and it was spaces specifically almost not 100% with Hong Kong, but as I mentioned at the very beginning, is that connection between Asian Americans and protest movements here in the States. And
Hmm.
there was a lot of conversations I had with my family, in a sense that when this whole movement with George Floyd happened, and what's been
Breonna
happening,
Taylor and stuff.
Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think there was a good contingent of Asian Americans that were saying, I absolutely not do not support this because of the rioting and what's been happening in the streets. And I was trying to recontextualize. It's like these are communities that feel like they've been policed to the brink, to the point where they have no options. These organizations that were meant to serve and protect are actively killing people. and can you imagine, can you make that connection with what's happening in Hong Kong with police brutality happening in that area, and like let's draw that connection. Let's see how the Black Lives Matter movement connects with what's happening in Hong Kong. And I just want to kind of leave with this last kind of topic of like, because I've had conversations with friends and family about like how they feel like absolutely no, like these protests are devalued because there's riots. And I feel like I think we're missing the message if we have those comments almost. Have you ever had conversations about Asians for Black Lives or like the Black Lives Matter movement in your family?
Oh man, my parents, my pro Hong Kong parents, just I don't think they understand, or they don't make the effort to understand what a black person in the states have to go through. And even of course I don't understand because I'm not in their shoes.
Yeah.
Um, but at least we can try to understand, listen to them, and just support however we can.
Hmm.
Um, Again, with the rioting and stuff, with every protest, it's not 100% organized. No organization, no protest is going to be able to control what individuals do themselves.
Hmm.
Um, but with the media and everything, and actually, with what's interesting is Hong Kong media's portrayal of these Black Lives Matter movements, um, as being riots and opportunity to loot, and rob businesses. My parents and my family, it's been really tough talking to them about Black Lives Matter. But as an Asian American, I think this is how I can help participate in uh, Black Lives Matter,
Yeah.
by having conversations with people in my community.
Yeah, I try my best to have a line of communication with my folks about it, because they're Cambodian refugees, survived the genocide, and they lived through the LA riots like 92. They were in Echo Park when all of that happened. And so you could imagine how they're feeling when they see images of like businesses being broken into and things like that. But at the same point, I want to have like a constructive conversation of like, okay, then if this is happening, why did it come to rioting? Why
Right.
why did it like not dwell on 100% the outcome, like say like rioting, but understanding what this movement is trying to say, you
Right,
know.
right. I'm not sure if your parents see you talking about um, Black Lives Matter's issue as disrespectful to them.
um I think they're I feel like they're opening up more, that I have more of a political opinion about things. Earlier in like say college and high school, very idealistic, very much um unnuanced, wanting to change everything that I could see in front of me. But now it's almost as if like I needed to kind of break it down and really explain like this is happening because of X. And um in the framework of what's been happening in the Black Lives Matter movement, it's like this is happening because there's over policing and almost a profiling of like police treat people of color a certain way versus person that are non person of color. And I'm trying to like let them recognize that, because of course they'll have police that interact with them in a very positive way, because of course they own a donut shop. They're already going to have a certain feeling and certain support within the community. But at that point, um connecting it to the Black Lives Matter movement, it's like I can't necessarily dictate what the movement is about, because I'm not black. But I can be I'm willing to listen, hear what these activists has to say, and then try to translate as much as possible to my parents' language what's been happening, and like why is this important. Like try to
Right.
really think about how um get into the shoes and in the mindset of what a what it means to be black in the US.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So my parents, um, they see me speaking out with a different subject, I guess, that I have more knowledge on, as disrespectful, thinking that I'm trying, as a child, I'm trying to teach them something. I think some of my friends have reached out to me saying that they have also experienced this issue, and saying, it's just not a constructive conversation. It's just screaming and yelling matches, and it feels like our parents are taking it really personally when it's not meant to be like that.
Yeah.
Right. And the image of police brutality, what I think a lot of immigrant parents um, see is that, wow, America, this, the reason I use the word America is this is how what we think, like America the beautiful and whatnot, not the United States, but um, America, this progressive, this amazing country,
Mm-hmm.
this westernized nation superpower. How can they have bad police? It's just, it's not a thought. Like, yes, police are people too. There are great police, there are bad police. They're individuals that control their own actions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so when uh, we see corrupt police in different countries, the immigrants can't contextualize or can't see that American polices can be bad too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And I remember seeing this meme where it's like it's a Cambodian donut shop having to figure out, do I support the Black Lives Matter movement? But I also own a donut shop, so like, well, where can I go? Well, what's going on? And it's like basically SpongeBob's kind of like sweating, trying to pick a
Right, right.
trying to pick a side. It's like, what do I do? What do I do? As a
I I recently had a conversation with my teammates about the Black Lives Matters movement,
Mhm,
and one of my teammates who's black, her father is a police officer.
mhm,
And he's an African American police officer. So a lot of the time she feels like she's being torn to choose either between being black and her father's occupation,
mhm.
which which shouldn't be happening. That's not the
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah, and I think the child, like like um the the person's dynamic. Sorry, I said child. This person is
The
probably an
teammate,
adult.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
she is an
yeah,
adult, yes.
yeah. Your teammate is like she or
She, yes.
whoever. Um, she is not her father's past. She is not her. Like she herself is not a police officer, right?
Right.
And that shouldn't necessarily dictate the people she can interact with and stuff like that, because she is her own person. And yeah, I feel to some degree it's like if I feel bad if it's like a family member that's like a police officer, and like in the community, if you're trying to advocate for Black lives, it's like, well, how can you advocate for Black lives if you have family and friends that are within the police department?
Right, and
Mm,
which is very crazy how um her father was actually the person being called in uh to see these protests, because it's almost as if they're using a black police officer as a
as a way, it's like,
yeah,
hooray, we
yeah, that
fixed
the
the problem
police
of
are not
race.
racist. Yeah, by sending black police officers
Mhm.
to these protests.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like this is so much to discuss. I feel
It is a lot. This is
yeah,
a whole university course in itself.
yeah, being Asian in the US, the topic of Hong Kong and China's relationship. And I'm pretty sure
Being
uh
Asian American
being
with
Asian American in
supporting Black
general.
Lives Matter.
Yeah, and I'm for sure 100% we're probably missing certain things about Hong Kong and the BLM movement, in the sense of Asians for BLM, and all the things. We're gonna be we probably missed a lot, but I hope, and I've said this before, my hope is that this is a further conversation. It's like the conversation of those topics don't just stop with just this one podcast. and it should continue. Like, I really hope that this protest movement really shows how, you know policing has been turned into this idea of, like, people of color feel like they're living in almost a police state, where they feel like they're already profiled before a police officer comes in for a traffic stop, or if they're just standing on a sidewalk just trying to mind their own business, or even in the
Waiting outside in Starbucks.
or just trying to enjoy bird watching in New York, just being themselves. And I think as a community, we got to, at least in the Asian American community, we need to really look into ourselves to see where we align in this conversation of race, of being American, where we fit into to being allies in other communities. So I think I might be wrapping things up a little bit, and it does kind of sound like it. I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to say thank you. Do you want to plug in any of your social media if people want to follow you?
Um, yeah, sure. My Instagram is open. I actually do have a saved file, a featured highlights
Hmm.
for well, my time in Hong Kong, and I have documented some of the interactions I have had with both protesters and myself protesting, as
Hmm.
well as Hong Kong police and how they handle
Hmm.
uh, protesting and stuff like that.
Yeah. I th- I think we might need to do another podcast about more of your experiences in Hong Kong, and
Right, right.
maybe bring in some other guests that are that's, yeah, either been there or been covering what's been happening in Hong Kong. Maybe
You
we could
can
do.
oh, sorry. Yeah, you can put my Instagram in the description
Yeah,
below.
I'll definitely do that. And I hope you as audience can like and subscribe. If you I'm recently starting a SoundCloud with under a recommendation from one of my former guests. I hope you've learned something today. Thank you, Isabella, for being here.
Awesome. Thank you
I'll
for having
extend
me.
I'll try to extend the invitation again. I'm trying my best to have different people from different backgrounds right now.
Hmm.
So
That's awesome.
I'm hoping to have more interesting people like yourself on this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Great.
Bye.